Hello, and welcome to Master Otto's workshop. Today we're talking about workbenches. This video is for people who are interested in workbenches or who want to build their own woodworking workbench. We're going to talk first about a little bit of history of workbenches, and then we're going to talk about the characteristics. Damn it. We're going to talk about the history of workbenches a little bit, and then we'll cover the features of my workbench, and then we'll talk a little bit about construction of workbenches. God damn it. In 1769, André-Jacob Roubo published a four-part treatise called L'Art du Menuisier, or the Art of the Woodworker. Of particular interest in the Roubo's treatise is Plate 11. At the top of Plate 11, there's a depiction of the interior of a woodworking shop, and there are 8 massive woodworking benches on the floor of the shop. Let's take a look at how they're using these benches. The 2 gentlemen on the left have a workpiece pushed up against a planing stop. The gentleman on the far right workbench has a holdfast holding down a piece that he appears to be chiseling. In the middle of Plate 11, there's a drawing of a workbench. This is the Roubo style of workbench. Notice that it's massive, thick top, thick legs. There are 2 rows of dog holes drilled down the top of the workbench, and there's a steel holdfast protruding through one of these dog holes in the middle labeled A. There's a planing stop protruding through the top of the workbench on the far left labeled C. Notice that the faces of the legs are flush with the edge of the workbench, and this is by design. Not only is the top of the workbench a large working area, but the entire side of the workbench is also a large working area. There are dog holes drilled in the legs to help support material that is pushed up against the side of the workbench, and there's actually a planing stop on the far left edge labeled M. This is called a crochet hook. Now I want to point out a construction feature here. Notice at the bottom of the legs where they meet with the stretchers, there are 2 circles. These are actually the drawbar pins. This style of workbench is constructed with a mortise and tenon supplemented by drawbar pins. At the bottom of Plate 11, there's a drawing of various features of this Roubo workbench. On the left, Figure 2 is a massive leg of the workbench with 3 dog holes and a holdfast. In the center, Figures 3 and 4 show 2 views of a leg vise. This is a massive leg vise that is mounted to the leg of the workbench. It extends from the floor to the top of the workbench and is driven by a large screw. Also in Figure 4, you see a steel holdfast driven through one of the dog holes in the top of the workbench, and it's holding down a workpiece labeled K. On the far right is a planing stop. This is that square block of wood that's driven through a mortise in the top of the workbench. It can be a plain block of wood, or as you see in Figure 6, it can have a steel toothed hook driven into the top of the block that gives the planing stop a little more bite. Finally, Figure 7 is a grease box. This is a small wood box mounted underneath the top of the workbench. It's filled with grease to apply to the bottom of the hand planes to make them slicker. It can be rotated out of the way under the workbench or rotated out to access the grease. Roubo covered all of these features in great detail in his treatise. As written by Roubo, l'établi est la première et la plus nécessaire des outils de menuisier. The workbench is the first and most necessary of all tools for woodworking. It is made up of a top, 4 legs, 4 rails, and a bottom. The top is made from a sturdy planker table of 5 to 6 inches thick and 20 to 25 inches wide. Its length varies from 6 to 12 feet, but the most common length is 9 feet. Now let's take a look at the features of my workbench, including hold fast, sliding deadman, leg vise, crochet hook, planing stop, and tail vise. My workbench has been tailored to my needs. It's slightly shorter than the typical Roubo workbench at 6 feet, and it's slightly wider at 27 inches. I needed my workbench to pull double duty as the outfeed table for my table saw. I mounted a face vise to the end of my workbench as a non-standard tail vise, but with the row of dog holes it will still function perfectly well as a tail vise. I needed this type of vise on my workbench because my bench is a multifunction workbench and I do other things. For instance, I made this jig to hold my hand saws so I can sharpen and set the teeth. But this vise will still work perfectly well as a tail vise. With this peg in the vise, I can still lock material down on the workbench with either a hold fast or another workbench dog at the other end. Next up is the planing stop. This is a block of wood that's friction fit through a mortise in the workbench top. Be forewarned that the difference between friction fit and too loose is minuscule. You want it to be so tight that you have to hammer it. When you push a block of wood up against the planing stop, you want to make sure that the mortise is square to the bench top so that your workpiece also is square to the bench top. If you need a little more security and guidance with the workpiece, you can add a piece of wood with a hold fast. And when you're done, you can just tap the planing stop out of the way. This is a leg vise. It's mounted to the leg of the workbench and it extends from the floor to the top of the workbench. It's extremely powerful and is driven by a large wood screw. The vise is subject to racking like any other vise, and it has this parallel guide and a pin to help keep the face of the vise parallel to the leg so it doesn't rack. The leg vise is often used in conjunction with the crochet hook. If you need to work along the edge of a workpiece, you can put it in the leg vise and wedge it forward up against the crochet hook. You can also use the sliding deadman to support the other end of the piece of wood. This holds the workpiece very securely. If you need a little more support at the other end, you can add a hold fast. This is a grease box. It's mounted underneath the workbench with a 5/16 inch lag bolt. It can swing out and give you access to the grease, in this case wax. And the last feature I'll show you is the shelf underneath the workbench. Let's move on to the construction of this workbench. The bench top, legs, and stretchers were all constructed by laminating oak boards. The boards were 1.5 by 3.5 inches in size. Building a workbench by laminating boards together has particular advantages and disadvantages. There are many advantages to making a workbench out of laminated stock. For one, you can start with smaller stock to make bigger things, and you don't have to go out and buy giant pieces of wood. You can also make perfect mortises just by cutting out notches in your stock when you're laminating them up together. The disadvantages of a laminated construction should be obvious. You'll spend countless hours at the table saw, the joiner, the planer. You'll spend countless hours doing glue-ups. And then there's more time after glue up back at the joiner and the planer to get everything down to the proper size. Lastly, let's take a look at the drawbar pins, which are integral to the strength of this mortise and tenon joint. The holes for the drawbar pins are drilled all the way through the mortise. However, the corresponding holes in the tenon are drilled slightly offset by 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch closer to the shoulder. A drawbar pin tool is inserted into one of the holes and twisted to draw the mortise and tenon joint very tight. Then a drawbar pin is pounded into the other hole. Since the holes between the mortise and the tenon are slightly offset, the pin draws this joint very, very tight. The drawbar pin tool is a specialized tool that's used to tighten up the mortise and tenon joint before pounding in a drawbar pin. It has an asymmetrical tip so that merely rotating the tool will lever the tenon deeper into the mortise. The drawbar pin tool is then removed and a second drawbar pin is driven into the hole. This permanently locks the mortise and tenon together in a very tight joint. Drawbar pins must be very strong so they're reeved instead of cut so they're straight grained. Then they're pounded through successively smaller and smaller holes in a dowel plate until they reach the desired dimensions. Thank you for spending time with me here in Master Otto's workshop, and I hope that you've enjoyed our discussions about woodworking benches. Goodbye.